My name is Seema Iyer, and I oversee a project at the University of Baltimore called the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. And I have here with me Cheryl Knott, who's our research manager, and Carla Tilchin, who is a student intern with us. She's a PhD student at the university, at Johns Hopkins University, and we're grateful that she's here with us today. So the three of us are here to help answer questions and talk about a new project that we're working on called the Baltimore Community Change Project, and how you can get involved in the Baltimore Community Change Project after Healing City. So a little bit about us. We are the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance at the University of Baltimore. We have been working on getting data into the hands of communities for the last 22 years. I haven't been there for 22 years, but we are part of a learning network of cities around the country that are trying to figure out how to get data into the hands of communities, because data is power, data is knowledge, data is empowering, and that's what we're hoping to have be for all of you. So if you have questions about other cities, we might be able to connect you to our partners in other cities. We get a lot of people asking us about if there's a similar project, for example, in Washington, DC and other cities around the country. So this is what we do. We put out what's called the Vital Signs Report. It's over 110 different indicators. Every year we issue all these indicators around demographics and community development and health and arts and culture and workforce and training. And every year we've had the privilege of essentially kind of having a little bit of a stethoscope on all of our neighborhoods all the time. And so when the 2020 census data came out in August of 2021, just a couple of months ago, we had the both benefit and I think the burden to make sure that people could understand how all of the data that we've been tracking could be useful to understand what has changed, what has worked, what has changed in a bad way as well. So if you haven't heard yet, we have some preliminary findings from the 2020 census. The bad news is, of course, that Baltimore lost population. And the possibly worse news is that we are the only East Coast city to continue losing population. All of our other East Coast city, kind of sister cities along the East Coast, have started to turn themselves around. And we share so much in terms of our history over the last 7 decades that we really should be thinking about how to learn from our sister cities along the East Coast about why they grew and why we didn't. So this is just a quick map of all the 40 cities around the country that had at least 400,000 people in 2010. Only 4 cities, 4 out of 40, lost any population at all. We're in the same camp as Detroit, Milwaukee, and Memphis. And we have to really think about how did all these other cities grow? Like Omaha, Nebraska grew, but we didn't. It was really the decade of cities. Most rural areas actually experienced significant decline in the last decade, more than any other time in history, with the widespread nature of rural decline in the last decade. So we should have been able to kind of capitalize on the fact that there's a movement nationally towards urban areas, and obviously, again, along the East Coast. So we're focusing in on population change because even as a city, we lost 5.7% of our population. You all know that some neighborhoods are continuing to grow and some neighborhoods are continuing to decline. So we're going to be talking about the experience at the neighborhood level. And population change is a pretty simple indicator. You take time 1 and time 2 and subtract. And you're either going to be a growing neighborhood, a stable neighborhood, or a declining neighborhood. And when we get the census data, it's the best time for us to know at the neighborhood level whether or not you're one of these 3 things. So even if I tell you nothing else about a neighborhood, and if I just told you whether they grew or didn't grow in the last decade, you're going to know a lot more about that neighborhood, even if you've never visited. So if you have a growing neighborhood, you have problems of growth. You have experienced congestion. You experience price rising because you have limited supply for a growing demand. You have fear of displacement in growing neighborhoods. You have increased retail because retail loves when neighborhoods grow. And when you have increased retail, you tend to get crimes of opportunity, the robberies and the larcenies from the cars and things like that. If you're in a stable neighborhood, you have issues related to maintenance. Should I bump out the kitchen and modernize my bathrooms because I'm going to get a return on investment at some point when I go to sell? It's all about maintaining our spaces, maintaining the alleys, maintaining the yards, maintaining the schools, and rehabilitating the site. Because even in a stable neighborhood, you're going to need people to move in, even to remain this stable. And then unfortunately, in our declining neighborhoods, we kind of have every other kind of issue related to decline. So the number one thing that we see is vacant and abandoned buildings. When people leave, they don't take their houses with them. And then we get, unfortunately, kind of other issues of distress like concentrated poverty or high unemployment. And remember, if you're losing population, you're losing retail. And grocery stores are part of the retail conversation. Banks as well, in-person banking is a retail institution. And then unfortunately, it's the same places where we're seeing food deserts and school closings. So, I haven't told you anything more about this neighborhood except that they have a declining population. And yet everything else that we might care about that's related to this entire summit around healing and trauma is kind of at the ebb of all of that is the fact that in general, we're not replacing people once they leave. So this was the map from the previous decade. We had, this is from 2000 to 2010. We had lots of places in the city, even in the prior decade, that grew. This is what Dr. Lawrence Brown at Morgan State University calls the white L coming down the spine and around the water. And unfortunately, we have what Dr. Brown calls the black butterfly as declining. So the areas in red were declining. And so this was the map for 10 years until we came with new data for the 2020 census. And it's a little bit like Groundhog's Day because it's unfortunately almost the identical map. And what is this telling us? This is telling us that the same neighborhoods that grew continued to grow and the same neighborhoods that declined continued to decline. And so it's this idea of, Newton's law, a body in motion stays in motion. Once a neighborhood achieves a certain level of economic momentum or growth momentum, they're staying on that momentum. And unfortunately, conversely is true too. So we had a couple of exceptions. One in kind of that was declining was the area around Johns Hopkins Homewood campus. This is the greater Charles Village, Barclay area. Saw some moderate decline in the prior decade, but saw gains in this decade. So maybe we can learn from what happened in this Barclay area. And then conversely, we have Brooklyn Curtis Bay that was growing in the previous decade, but then saw some moderate declines in this decade. So, how can we make sure that we turn this back around? So if we want to think about, there's obviously a racial pattern, but you can tell that there's more to the story than prior kind of structural racist elements, that we have modern day things that are happening that are causing population decline. And so from an economic point of view, this is called divergence. Enrico Morietti is the economist that coined this term, and he was thinking about how different cities experience kind of diverging economic fortunes. But we're kind of seeing that happen within our city, where we have some neighborhoods that are just gaining and gaining and gaining everything, and some neighborhoods that are kind of not gaining continuously. And the way to think about how that could be true, and we know this, we drive from one neighborhood to another, and it's kind of like night and day. How can it be that we have these two neighborhoods right next door to each other and they're experiencing such different fortunes? And the reason is because it's not just the physical nature of the space, it is what is not connecting to that space. So neighborhoods that are growing are connected. They have connectivity to digital, physical, social, and financial resources. And the way to think about it is in this little graphic, which is probably very simplistic. If we have two computers, you get one connection between the two computers. And one computer alone doesn't get you anything. It's the connection between the two computers that gets us connectivity. But once I increase that to 4 computers, I actually increase the number of connections by 6 times. And then if I double it again to 8 users, I actually increase the number of connections again by another 4 times. So there's an exponential growth in the number of connections. And it's in this kind of thickness of connections that we know from like social networks that this is where ideas form, this is where innovation happens, this is where knowledge gets gained, this is where people get support, this is where resilience happens, is in this web of connections. And that is what is missing in some of our neighborhoods. It is that connectivity to things that are, again, digital, social, financial. And once we kind of reconnect some of our neighborhoods, then we can actually start to see our fortunes not diverge so much. So we have this project called the Baltimore Change Project to really kind of help people understand what is it about the connectivity and what is it about how things are changing. And again, it doesn't have to be physical connectivity, and we're going to kind of talk about how people are connected by what they're working on. And that the act of monitoring is about empowerment. Our communities are changing all the time. And so helping people monitor is a way for all of you to stay empowered into the future and as an act of learning into the future. So we have 6 different reports. We're not going to talk about all 6 of them, but we will invite you to join us for a bunch of different things that we're working on this month. But I'm actually going to turn it over to Carla, I think, to talk about the 6th one, because we thought this one would be the most relevant for this particular crowd on how things have changed with respect to quality of life.
Thanks, Seema. As Seema mentioned, we created these 6 briefs that cover sort of the main indicators that BINA has been tracking for decades. And we saw a lot of encouraging improvement and quality in life in the past decade. So we saw improvements in the teen birth rate. We saw a decrease in the proportion of kids 0 to 6 with elevated blood levels, decreases in the property crime rate, decreases in the density of off-premise liquor outlets, and decreases in the rate of dirty street and alley reports through 311. But some things didn't improve. So we saw that life expectancy decreased across the city, violent crime rates increased, and gun-related homicide rates increased. So in the way that sort of population change is a really powerful metric for the health of a neighborhood, life expectancy is sort of the ultimate health indicator. And so right here we have the 2 maps side by side. On the left, you're looking at life expectancy, where blue values are higher life expectancy and red values are lower life expectancy. And you can see that that maps really closely onto where we see neighborhoods that decline and neighborhoods that grow, sort of further showing the story of why neighborhoods matter and why population growth matters. So one huge success for Baltimore in the past decade is a really big decrease in teen birth rate. So across the whole city, the teen birth rate declined 60%, which is really powerful. And this graph is showing communities across the city. We call them community statistical areas. They're sort of combinations of census groups that more closely relate to how people sort of know and understand their neighborhoods. And you can see that almost all communities declined, with some really big declines across the city. And so looking at this great success, we sort of spoke with experts in child and maternal health to try to understand what they thought was behind sort of this really successful decrease. And one big message from them was that in the past decade, there's been increased access to Title X clinics and federally qualified health centers, expanded family planning through school health, and a focus on making services more youth-friendly. So on the right, you have a map of the city, and the icons refer to these Title X clinics and federally qualified health centers. And I know you couldn't see all the names of the communities very well in the last slide, but if you map the communities that had the highest teen birth rates still in 2019, they were communities that had lower access to these clinics, sort of further suggesting that easy access is really important. in reducing the teen birth rate. So another thing we wanted to focus on is gun violence. So I'm sure you all have known that Baltimore has seen over 300 homicides every year since 2015. On the right, you have a graph of just the rate of homicide per 1,000 residents going from 2011 to 2020. And it increased by 0.3 incidents per 1,000 people across the decade, which is kind of a hard number to understand, but I think the trend itself is powerful, and I think something that a lot of us are familiar with. One interesting thing is that the homicide rate did not increase from 2019 to 2020, which is different than most cities in the US during the COVID-19 pandemic. We also know, of course, that homicide is not distributed equally across the city. So this is the same type of graph that we saw for the teen birth rate, but you can see it's sort of shifted where we saw a lot of really powerful decline in teen birth rate. We now see that most communities saw an increase in gun-related homicide in the past decade. And the biggest increases in the rate of homicide were seen in Pimlico, Southwest Baltimore, Madison East End, Poppleton, Hollands Market, and Edmondson Village. So something that we have started to think about now that we've sort of been able to collect all this data and put it out there is to figure out what to do with it and what to learn from it. So for example, we saw that Brooklyn saw the largest decrease in gun-related homicide in the past decade, and Cherry Hill saw sort of a moderate increase. So we start asking questions like, what can Cherry Hill learn from Brooklyn, and what happened in Brooklyn that maybe didn't happen in Cherry Hill? And then we also think across indicators. So what can violence reduction advocates and change leaders, like I'm sure some of you, learn from the success and decline in teen birth rates? And just in general, you know, going around and asking folks what has worked in your community and sort of what ideas this is sparking for you all. So I'll send it back to take that where that next is going.
Yeah, so we're going to come back to those questions with you in this group. And I know we have a couple of questions already in the chat, which we definitely want to answer. And we want to actually show you how to answer these questions because it's all about empowerment, but we're going to do that together. But in general, we are headed towards a bunch of different fun things to do over the next month. We want, again, this way for communities to get to know each other, get to know each other's issues, because a lot of times you'll find that you have similar issues to neighborhoods across town, but because you're not physically located next to them, you might not know that there's something that you might have in common that you want to build a coalition around. So this summit is one way that we might do that, but we also have a summit coming up on March 21st to the 26th. And maybe Cheryl, you can put in the chat kind of how to stay connected with us. We will have neighborhood trivia nights because we want to have fun ways for us to get to know each other. Every one of our neighborhoods has interesting things that, you know, we may or may not know about if you've never been to those neighborhoods. And then we're also doing some cross neighborhood tours to get people to physically actually visit each other's neighborhoods and talk about things that have worked in their neighborhood. So this is one thing that we're coming up on, the neighborhood trivia. Again, you don't need to have a team already. It is free. It is not a fundraiser in any way. We're not going to ask you for money. This is really about learning and helping people connect with each other in ways that they might not have done in the past. And then this is the website link about how to stay connected with us as we move forward. So I am going to answer Sharika Bolden. Is that correct? Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. I'm going to answer your question by actually walking you through our website around the issue of digital connections and digital connectivity and its relationship to quality of life, because it's so important. Like I mentioned, you know, when places are disconnected along any of those domains, we can see kind of what other issues might be. But we did find So this is our overall website. All of the issue briefs that we didn't talk about are on this site. We mostly focused on issue brief number 6, but number 5 is all about connectivity. And here we found that digital connectivity was related to some other indicators of distress. So if you did not have, if many of your community members did not have access to the internet, they were more likely, I'm trying to get to the little correlation map as we get down here. So relationships for people that do not have access to the internet, predominantly going to be in African-American neighborhoods, not so much of a problem in white neighborhoods. The median income would be lower in neighborhoods without connectivity at home. The unemployment rate would be higher. And we lost population in exactly these areas that did not have digital connectivity. So, without being connected, the neighborhood itself, and this is along one issue, which is digital connectivity. We have another report that talks about physical connectivity, like through the transit system, and it's the same problem. And in fact, digital connectivity and lack of access to transit was also, or high commute times are also connected. So yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, lack of access to the internet at home is a huge quality of life problem. So that's one way to kind of find your answer. And I'm going to show you some other ways too, but did you have another? Yeah, hopefully that answered your question. And if not, I'm happy to take you off mute and you can answer it.
Yeah, that was helpful. As you were talking about how, that web of support, kind of impacts stability, I was just thinking about if that web includes digital connection. So if I'm now ordering my groceries instead of walking to the store and getting them, or if, I'm getting social support or connection from a friend who's across town via a Zoom call instead of sitting together on our front steps, does replacing a physical connection with a digital connection have any kind of impact? If that makes sense.
So the issue with connectivity is more is just more, right? So you want all of those connections. You want the social connection, you want the digital connection, you want the physical connection. You really need all of it. So I don't know if it necessarily replaces social connection, but without the digital connection, there's just so many things that we don't have. So hopefully not suggesting that we do one or the other. I want it to be all. So this is the map, though, of where we see, places in the city without much access to the internet at home coming into the pandemic. And you can see it's the same, pattern. The good news is that we have in this research report kind of ways for us all to think about what might be coming down the pike, especially with the ARPA funding. And so if you read, the mayor is putting some American, what is ARPA? American Rescue Plan Act. He is investing for Wi-Fi access into these targeted neighborhoods. So we mapped them out for all of you to see kind of where some of our ARPA dollars are going. Obviously, I think we need much more, but this is the beginning. And thinking through with you, what would this look like in terms of potential solutions? And that's what we're after. But you're right, like people's had to access social services through, online options, and not just social services, but like legal services, workforce development services, all of it had to go online during the pandemic. And it was very difficult for some of our neighborhoods to make that happen. I don't know, does anybody have other experience with trying to get folks digital access during the pandemic? I mean, in some ways, we're all on the Zoom call, so we have a little bit of self-selection that we could all be here. But yeah, we know that there's just so many people that couldn't be here. The school system certainly helped a lot with trying to at least distribute devices. And we do have, information on these reports on what, other resources you could have in the city. The other awesome thing, hopefully, that you might find interesting about our website is all of the data that Carla went through is available for you to access interactively. So I'm just going to show you how to do that. And you can start to ask your own questions, which is what we're hoping. That if you have a particular interest in any one of these indicators, that this is a place for you to come or anybody to come and answer those questions. So what changed in the city? This becomes an interactive way for you to look at that instead of just looking at our PowerPoint presentation. Thank you, Cheryl, for putting that link in the chat. And we looked at kind of different ways of helping you look at, if you're interested in digital resources or if you're interested in anything, these are all of the indicators that are part of this overall project. Like I said, there's over 100. But if I don't know if anybody wants me to click on any one of these, let me know. But so for example, physically, what areas of the city saw an increase in the travel time? Because travel time is a lack of connectivity, physically. And if you have so many people in your neighborhood traveling more than 45 minutes to get to work, you're losing your workers from your neighborhood for at least an hour and a half every day, right? And these are the people that can't come to the parent-teacher conversation or can't come to the block party cleanup or can't come to the meeting that's occurring in your neighborhood because they're traveling so far to get to work. And so we saw kind of rises in, Greater Mondawmin, which is kind of a surprise because Greater Mondawmin is a transit hub, right? It has both the metro and all these buses. So what's happening here? Edmondson Village, Brooklyn, Curtis Bay, Forest Park, Bel Air, Edison saw these rises. And then you can look at anything in what's called a scatter plot. So you can take two different indicators and plot them together so you can see how something changed in one versus how something changed in another. What's a good one? What do you think? What would be a good one from quality of life? So you had the question about which areas saw maybe a rise in violent crime and which ones saw maybe a decrease in birth rates. I haven't done this yet, so I don't know what relationship we're going to find. You're going to be doing this with me. But so let's look at the relationship between violence, crime, and teen birth rate. I have no kind of theoretical reason of why I'm looking at this, but that's kind of the point, to make a very exploratory way for people to ask questions. And if there's nothing comes of your question, that's okay too. And so any of the scatter plots, what you'll find is the orange means that you had a negative in one and a positive in the other. So in this case, orange means you reduced violent crime, but you actually increased teen birth rate. And then the other kind of axis is that you increased violent crime, but decreased birth rate. We can see there's not much of a relationship here, a pretty straight line or pretty flat line. And then we have this outlier in downtown that saw kind of dramatic reductions in both violent crime and teen birth rate. And then a little bit of an outlier in the opposite direction where we saw an increase in violent crime, but a severe decrease in teen birth rate. So how can we kind of understand what the experience was in Oliver Johnston Square versus, downtown, which is not that far. These are not far from each other. They're practically next door. Anyway, I could spend the next hour showing you these fun ways to look at scatter plots, but happy to answer any questions or have a chat about, things that you have seen that are working in your neighborhood. And I'll go back to the Mentimeter to see what we found. Or anything that I missed. How many people were familiar with the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance in the past? We always have something that's called Baltimore Data Week, which I think some of you have actually been to. I see some familiar names. Baltimore Data Week is generally in July. It used to be Baltimore Data Day before the pandemic, and then we made it into a whole week. And we're hoping to go back to a day, because not only is that a little bit more manageable for our staff, but it's also better to be in person. We are ready to kind of reconvene, because in most times it's the conversations that happen outside of the presentations that are really exciting. We could also use your help about how to kind of advertise our overall project, right? So we have all of this stuff is coming up right now. So if you have ideas of where we should promote our trivia nights, we will take that. It's meant for all ages, all neighborhoods. Again, you don't have to have a team to come on board, which some other trivia things you do. It's meant to really be both a way to test your good knowledge of Baltimore, but also kind of learn something about neighborhoods in the city. Hopefully all of you will sign up for trivia and tell your friends. And then we are going to be headed into our convening, which I will show you all of the fun things that are happening in our neighborhood convenings too. So let me show you that 1 second. Trying to get all my screens to work here, because we are coming up against our own time. So yeah, neighborhood trivia nights coming up every Thursday for the next 3 Thursdays, not this Thursday, but starting next week. We will have webinars, which you can register for right now. People responding to each one of the issue briefs. So if, in particular, if you were interested in this quality of life brief, we have respondents. But all of these are half-hour webinars that you're welcome to join us for, to learn about, how experts in the field look at these reports. And then we have a series of community summits. We have 7 during the week of the 21st to basically be in small groups, have you all come up with your solutions about what, again, worked in your neighborhood. What do you want to see change? What are your solutions to helping kind of move the needle for the next decade? Because we cannot have a city ethically, financially, spiritually, psychologically, where some of our neighborhoods continue to decline right next door to neighborhoods that continue to grow. We cannot be this kind of city. We don't have to be this kind of city. Every other city in the nation is showing us that we don't have to live like this. So what can we do together to cross-fertilize ideas, band together, build coalitions, and actually get a new map in 2030? Wouldn't it be awesome if all neighborhoods were thriving and all neighborhoods were places of opportunity? That doesn't mean that all neighborhoods have to be the same. In fact, it shouldn't be that way. It should be that different neighborhoods appeal to different kinds of folks so that we're an inclusive, awesome city to live in. And if you think about the great cities of the world, that is true. Different neighborhoods appeal to different kinds of folks. What if we have the new Wakanda, as Dr. Brown calls it, along Pennsylvania Avenue, that's like this great magnet of African-American culture and entrepreneurship and activity. What if we have, the best neighborhood in the planet for women to live, because women are actually the #1 owners of houses in the city. Most new homeowners in the city of Baltimore are single women. So what if we created kind of the best, safest, whatever women want in a neighborhood, and make it like a mecca for single female-headed households who are purchasing houses. So it's not that every neighborhood needs to live the same. It's just that they all need to be places of opportunity that are well connected and well resourced and sustainable into the future. And that's the kind of city that we all want, at least to the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. And that's what we want to bring you along with us during this convening process. So if there's no more questions, I think we covered everything that we wanted to cover, right? We are available. Please feel free to let us connect with us for any reason. If you want this data or any other data about your neighborhood and you want more information about the convenings. And thank you so much and have a great Healing City event.